In today's video, I'm going to be comparing the Canon R3 to the Canon R5 for wildlife photography. Now, I've broken this down into multiple categories that I believe are the most important things that a camera needs to have for wildlife photography. And I'm going to talk about how both of these cameras perform in each of these categories. And then at the end, I'll discuss whether I believe that between these two cameras, the Canon R3 and the Canon R5, there's a definitively better one for wildlife photography. And before I get into this, I do just want to say this is totally my opinion and based on my experience with the cameras. There might be some things that I care about in regards to the R3 and the R5 that you personally don't care about at all. This is just based on my experience with them and based on the things that I value in a good wildlife camera and what I think is necessary out of a camera body to capture the best wildlife images possible. So the first category is going to be weight / size / build as well, because it's going to be based on really how does this camera handle? Is it too heavy? Is it too light? Is it the right shape and size? All that stuff basically goes into this category. And immediately right off the bat, you already know that the Canon R5 is smaller and lighter than the R3. So as far as weight and size goes, the R5 is going to win. You're going to be able to handhold it easier. You're going to be able to carry it around and pack it into smaller places much easier. And so that's a win on the R5's part. But you also have to take into account the fact that the R3 is built a lot better. Not that the R5 isn't built super well, but the R3 is just built better. And it has that built-in battery grip on the bottom that is so helpful and really nice, and something that I wish was included with the R5 as opposed to having to attach a battery grip later. And overall, I just feel like the R3 feels better in your hand than the R5. But since the R5 is smaller and lighter and easier to carry around, I'm not really going to pick a definitive winner in this category. I'm just going to say that there are pros and cons to both. And for the first category, it's going to be a draw between these two cameras. For the second category, I want to talk about the sensors on these cameras and the megapixel counts. So immediately, once again, the R5 is going to come out of the gate strong with those 45 megapixels. That's just much better than 24. There's no way around that. Obviously with 24, you're going to have smaller file size, which is nice. But besides that, the R5 allows so much more flexibility for cropping and captures so much more detail. So it wins in that regard. But you also have to take into consideration the fact that the R3 does have a stacked sensor, which is very nice and is something that the R3 doesn't have. And with this stacked sensor, you get much faster readout speeds on the R3 and you reduce the effects of rolling shutter on your photos. So that is something important to take into account about the R3 as well. Definitely having that stacked sensor is very helpful. But as far as the winner in this category, given that personally I've never really had any trouble with the rolling shutter on the R5, I know that it's there. I've seen people showcase it before, but it's not something that is super prevalent in your photos on the R5. In all my time shooting with the R5, it's never something that I've had to deal with. So personally, I would choose 45 megapixels over the stacked sensor. So I'm going to give it to the R5 in this category. It provides more flexibility, and having 45 megapixels to capture so much detail and crop in so much is very nice. And to me, is a better feature than having a stacked sensor and 24 megapixels. However, I should also note that the R3 sensor is also back illuminated. That's something I forgot to mention. With the back illuminated sensors, low light capabilities are a lot better. So take that into account as well. Now, the third category is going to be autofocus on these cameras. And I would like to say that my experience in this is a little bit limited by the fact that the only lens that I've shot both of these cameras on is the 100 to 400 up here. And based on other people that I've talked to, what I experienced with the R3 in terms of autofocusing speed and accuracy has definitely been limited by the fact that I shot on this lens. It was better than the R5, but not a whole lot better. And based on others that I've talked to, they had different experiences and found that the R3 was a lot better in terms of focusing speed and accuracy and low light capabilities. So I wanted to note on that, but I do want to say that in my experience, both cameras are extremely fast and extremely accurate when it comes to autofocus. Definitely two of the very best cameras on the market in regards to autofocus. However, the R3 definitely does edge out the R5 in terms of speed and accuracy. But even beyond that, if we set aside focusing speed and accuracy and how well it focuses in low light, and we just focus on the different options that you have for focusing and all the customization that you have within the autofocusing menus, on the R3 versus the R3 blows the R5 out of the water. Obviously on the R5, you get your classic methods that we had on the DSLRs, whether it be spot AF, zone AF, any of that. And you also get animal eye AF, which was a huge step up for the R5. But then when you go up to the R3, you also get eye control AF. And while personally I didn't find eye control super helpful for wildlife, there definitely are some situations in which you can apply it to wildlife photography, and it's much better to have it there as an option on the camera and not use it than to not have it like on the R5, but want to be able to use it. So just having that extra option is really nice on the R3. Plus, you have so much more customization in the menus to allow you to set up different autofocus methods on different buttons, much more customization than you get on the R5. And on top of that, you have the new touch controller on the R3, which was by far my favorite feature of the R3. It's basically like a much better version of the joystick, where all you have to do is slide your finger around on this kind of touch screen on the back, and it moves your autofocus point with ridiculous precision and speed, and honestly makes the joystick that you use on the R5 feel ancient and slow. It is so much better with the touch controller to be able to move your autofocus point around. And again, setting aside focusing speed and accuracy and all that, just those few things that I listed there blow the R5 out of the water in terms of autofocusing, customization options, and really just solidify that the R3 is definitely the better camera when it comes to autofocus. It's faster, it's more accurate, and it has so many more options for autofocus that really exceed everything on the R5. For the next category, I want to talk about high ISO noise handling, and we're going to do this by taking a look at some example files on the computer. So jumping into this, you can see this is a photo that I took on the R5. This was ISO 8000, and as you can see, it is definitely underexposed. I apologize for that. This scene was happening very fast and I didn't really have time to get exposure perfectly correct. Still, all the details there, you know, I can bring it up and still get all my detail out of it, but it is underexposed. But taking a look at the noise in this ISO 8000 file on the R5, you can see that honestly the R5 has handled noise very, very well. It's pretty minimal generally in this photo. It's definitely there, but it's not bad by any means, and especially when you're zoomed out like this, it's really not even noticeable. You don't see really any noise in this photo with the full frame file. Now let's go over and look at ISO 8000 on the R3. So here's a file also shot at ISO 8000, and as you can see when I zoom in here to 100%, definitely much, much cleaner. There's definitely still noise there, just like there was in the R5 file, but it's way cleaner. Way, way cleaner, especially in the background there and on the animal. You can see so much more fur detail. And just switching back over to the bear photo here to show you guys the difference once again. Look at the noise present here in this tree above the bear and even in the bear's fur compared to the noise in the background of this photo and on the elk's fur. Definitely a lot cleaner on the R3. And to showcase this even further, I found two files that were shot at two different ISOs on the R5 and on the R3, with very similar amounts of noise in them. And I'm going to show you how these compare next to each other. So first of all, I have this file from the R5 that was shot at ISO 10,000, and when I zoom into 100%, you can see here that we have a pretty good amount of noise. It's still, for a 45 megapixel camera, pretty darn clean, but there is definitely some noise there that is very visible, especially when you zoom in like this. But now let's go over to the file from the R3 that I think has a very similar level of noise, and this is a file that was shot at ISO 16,000. So we've gone from 10,000 to 16,000, and you can see here that it's got a pretty similar amount of noise, maybe honestly even a little less here on the R3 file, but it's pretty close, pretty similar on the amount of noise here. And you can just see this was shot at 16,000, has this level of noise. And when I go back over to this owl photo, this was shot at 10,000 and has a very similar level of noise. Honestly, maybe even a little bit more noise on the R5 file. I honestly think that the ISO 16,000 R3 file is a little bit cleaner, which is just crazy and really showcases that the R3 is definitely the superior camera when it comes to noise handling. It is much better in this regard. Don't get me wrong, the R5 is amazing, especially for a camera with such high megapixels, but despite that, the R3 is the very clear winner here. Next, I want to talk about frame rates. So with the mechanical shutter on both the R3 and the R5, you get 12 frames a second. So that's even on both cameras. But when you step up to the electronic shutter, this is where there's a difference. On the R5, you get 20 frames a second. On the R3, you get 30 frames a second. And to showcase the difference that this has when you're out in the field shooting, I've got some more sample photos here. So here's the R3 shot at 30 frames a second. And you can see as I click through these, that you get basically every small movement of the elk's mouth as he's moving it around. And I moved the camera a little bit there, as you can see, so that doesn't exactly line up. But generally, you get every tiny movement of his mouth, and even in between these two frames, you can see there that his eyes close just ever so slightly, and the mouth moves to the side just a little bit. And basically you can see here that you capture every single little movement with 30 frames a second and should have no trouble capturing exactly the moment that you're looking for, where the animal is in exactly the position that you want when you're shooting with 30 frames a second on the R3. And now to showcase 20 frames a second on the R5, I have some more sample images here. And as you can see in this first sequence of 3 photos here, we have a goose with his mouth open, and you can see here that the tongue just has the tiniest movement in between these two. And the goose does shift just a little bit in the frame. And then moving on to the third photo here, his mouth is now all the way closed. And while this definitely captured a lot of the motion there, it doesn't capture necessarily all of it. You have this moment right here between this frame where his mouth is open and this frame right here where his mouth is closed. that I think that 30 frames a second would have helped in this situation if you were looking for a little bit of a different mouth position, because you basically go from almost wide open in this frame to totally closed in this frame, which isn't totally ideal. You would want to have something kind of in between that, and with 30 frames a second, you would get that. Now, I know that is a little bit nitpicky, but it does make an impact, and when you're looking for that perfect moment, 30 frames a second will help you capture that perfect moment a lot more than 20 frames a second will. Even though 20 frames a second is really great and is unheard of up until like the last 2 years or so, 30 frames a second is just simply better, and in regards to frame rate, the R3 has won once again. For the next category, we're going to talk about battery life, and once again, the R3 has won in this category. Pretty obvious, with that built-in grip on the bottom, you use the larger Canon batteries and they last much longer. So the R3 wins this one as well. Now, I don't know how the R5 might perform with the battery group. It might perform just as good or better than the R3, but in my experience, comparing just the base models of the R3 and the R5, the R3 has better battery life. Now, I had 2 more categories after this one that I was going to go into detail about, but honestly, I don't see the need to because they're the exact same on both cameras. Those 2 categories are stabilization and memory card slots. Both cameras have the exact same in-body stabilization that allows for 8 stops of image stabilization and is pretty darn amazing on both of them. But it is the exact same system in both, so you can't really compare these. And it's the same in regards to memory card slots in these cameras. In both the R3 and the R5, you have a CF Express card slot and then an SD card slot, and those are your options for memory cards. So the next category is price, and this is another one that is obviously pretty simple. Your R3 costs $6,000 and your R5 cost $3,900, so the R5 is the clear winner. But I also want to note on value in this category, which basically, what are you getting given the price that you're paying, and is it worth what you're paying for it? And for both the R3 and the R5, I think that they are worth what you pay for them, but I think you're going to get more bang for your buck out of the R5. You're getting a camera that has phenomenal autofocus, ISO handling, 45 megapixels, all that stuff for only $3,900. You're getting it for $2,100 cheaper than the R3, and it's a very comparable camera to the R3. Obviously, I don't want to spoil the end of the video and say which one I think is better of the 2, but given that they're even comparable and the R5 is that much cheaper, shows that it really has a better value than the R3, at least in my opinion. I think you're getting more bang for your buck out of the R5 than you are out of the R3, and price and value 100% goes to the R5. I think it's a really great deal given what you're getting out of that camera. And then the final category is going to be video on these 2 cameras, and you know, I'm not a huge video guy, but I do know at least what some of these specs mean in these cameras, and I have tested them out and you know, figured out which one I like better. And so starting out, both cameras have 4K 120, so both can film in the same quality and speed of slow motion, which is really nice. I love 4K 120. It eats up a lot of space on your memory cards for sure, but it's an awesome capability, and both cameras have that. But then stepping it up from there, your R3 has 6K 60 frames a second video, and your R5 has 8K 30 frames a second video. And so which of those 2 you prefer obviously depends on your personal preference. Maybe you'd rather have 60 frames a second and shoot at a little lower quality. Maybe you'd rather have 8K and shoot at a little lower frame rate. But for me personally, I prefer to have the 8K footage and shoot with a lower frame rate. I think 30 frames a second is plenty enough, and with 8K, I'm able to shoot, especially like out in Yellowstone when there are, you know, wolves or bears that are basically just a dot on a hillside way far away, which is pretty common in Yellowstone. With 8K, you can crop in on that footage and still get some decent stuff out of it. You know, sometimes you're going to deal with heat distortion and stuff like that at distances that far, but at least you can kind of tell what's going on at 8K and be able to crop in a lot. And even if it's not footage that's super artistic or could be used in videos, I like to have it just as documentation. And so for me personally, I prefer the 8K 30 frames a second, and I'm going to hand it to the R5 in terms of video capabilities. But I will say that they're both very similar, and this one is really a matter of opinion whether you want 8K with less frames a second or 6K with more frames a second. But for me, video goes to the R5. So that was my final category, and overall these cameras were pretty close, but as far as which one is the better camera for wildlife photography, I'm going to give it to the Canon R3. I think that the very most important categories for wildlife photography, the R3 won most of. Things like autofocus speed and high ISO noise handling are just more important than price or video capabilities when you're talking about how it performs as a wildlife camera. So because of that, I'm giving it to the R3. I felt like the R3 was a better wildlife camera. However, with that said, I don't think that necessarily means that the R3 is the definitive choice that you should go for when you're looking at your next wildlife camera between these 2. I think it really depends on a couple of different things. I think it depends on, number 1, what subjects do you primarily shoot? Number 2, what is your budget? And number 3, what lenses do you already have? So starting out with which subjects do you typically shoot? Let's say that, for example, you oftentimes shoot very small birds, and even with a 600mm lens, you like to crop in a lot because those birds are small, it's hard to get close to them, and you know, you really can never just fill the frame with them, so you have to have some cropping options. The R5 is going to be the better choice for you because even though it's lesser than the R3 in some of these other categories, it's not that much worse, and being able to crop in is going to be so much more crucial to you than having a little bit better autofocus speed or a little bit better high ISO performance. On the flip side, let's say that you primarily shoot bears in Alaska at Lake Clark National Park, and you can get super close to these animals and can always fill the frame and never really have to crop in at all. In this case, then maybe the R3 is a better choice because you never have to crop and you don't need those extra megapixels to get the photos that you're looking for. So that's really the first thing. I think it depends on the subject you're shooting, and that's a decision that you have to make based on what you shoot. Second of all, what is your budget? If you're shooting on a limited budget, and I say limited with quotation marks because let's be honest, both of these cameras are very expensive and very high-end cameras, but if you do have a more limited budget and you can't go all the way out to $6,000 for that R3, then maybe the R5 is the better choice. You know, maybe you get an R5 and you do kind of like what I did and also get a 100 to 400 to go with it. And then you have a camera and a lens as well for the same price that you would have gotten only a body with the R3. So I think it really does depend on your budget. Going back to the value that I talked about earlier, you're getting more bang for your buck out of the R5. So if you're shooting on a more limited budget, then go for the R5. But if you have an unlimited budget, then the R3 is probably the better choice for you. And then the final category is what lens do you use? If you're looking to upgrade both your camera and your lens, then maybe you go for the R5 because you're spending a little bit less money, and then that allows you to have that extra $2,000 that you saved to put towards a better lens. Not to mention that with that extra flexibility that you get with cropping on the R5, you can get away with a lens with less range like the 100 to 400 if that's the only lens that you have. But let's say that you've already got a big 600 f4 and you don't plan on replacing your lens and you're just looking to invest in a really great camera as your next upgrade, then maybe the R3 is the better option. So it's really a matter of these three factors and weighing these to determine which one you should get. Overall, I think that the R3 is the better wildlife camera, but it doesn't mean that you should necessarily invest in the R3. So that is my comparison on the Canon R3 versus the Canon R5 for wildlife photography. But before I close this out, I do want to remind you guys to subscribe for that Alaska trip that I'll be giving away to go to Lake Clark and photograph coastal Alaskan brown bears when I hit 10,000 subscribers. Also, if you haven't already, comment down below, let me know what you guys thought, drop a like as well. Thank you all so much for watching and for your continued support. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and have found it helpful if you're looking at getting the R3 or the R5. And with that, guys, that's all I got for this one. I will see you all in the next video.